It was the first and most notorious serial murder case in American history. In 1965, Albert DeSalvo confessed to being the Boston Strangler, but he was never convicted of the 11 brutal, sexually deranged murders.
He knew things he could not have known from any source other than being on the scene of the crime.
But there is no physical evidence to link DeSalvo to the crimes.
There isn't proof that he was the strangler. In fact, the proof is that he wasn't the strangler.
People jump to conclusions. In murder, you can't afford to do that.
Was DeSalvo really the Boston Strangler, or a publicity-seeking false confessor?
Given the opportunity to confess to the worst serial killing since Jack the Ripper, he took it.
Did the real killer, or killers, get away with murder? Summer of 1962. The city of Boston is besieged by an unprecedented series of gruesome murders.
These were sensational crimes. Boston is a Puritan's town, and these were lurid, vicious, sexual crimes taking place.
During the 2-year reign of terror that followed, the bodies of 11 women are found strangled with their own nylons and lingerie.
We knew we had something because of the similarities in the way they were done. We knew we had a serial killer on our hands.
With each strike, the media's infatuation with the mystery killer ratchets up the climate of fear.
The city of Boston was in hysterics. The newspapers were announcing a phantom killer strikes again, scare headlines in 24-point type.
The pressure on the police to find the killer or killers is intense.
Boston has been portrayed by some as a city in the grip of terror.
We worked 24 hours a day and thought and lived the investigation of the stranglings.
Then, 3 years after the murders began, jailed sex offender Albert DeSalvo confesses to being the strangler.
No one else could possibly have known in exquisite detail what he knew about the crimes.
The investigation is shut down. All 11 murders are solved with the stroke of DeSalvo's pen. But not everyone working on the case is convinced.
Prosecutors, detectives were telling me that DeSalvo was not the strangler. It was common knowledge in the law enforcement community.
6 years later, DeSalvo is murdered in prison under suspicious circumstances. Some think he was about to recant his confession.
Somebody killed Albert to keep him quiet.
If DeSalvo wasn't the Boston Strangler, who was?
Albert DeSalvo was never a suspect till he decided to identify himself as the strangler. And there were a number of other much, much better suspects.
Many believe new forensic testing might solve the mystery.
DNA is the ultimate information of identification, and they're keeping that back from us. And the question is, are we entitled to that?
40 years after the fact, should the evidence be re-examined to try and prove DeSalvo's guilt or innocence once and for all? The first to die was Anna Slessers, a 55-year-old divorcee who lived alone in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood. From the crime scene, investigators deduced that Anna was listening to an opera on her record player and running a bath. She was murdered sometime during the day of June 14, 1962. No witnesses reported seeing anybody suspicious enter the building or walking up the stairwell to her third-floor apartment. As with all the stranglings, there was no sign of forced entry or screams heard by the neighbors. Anna must have willingly let her killer in the door. The body was found naked on the floor. A pool of blood had drained out of a gaping laceration on the back of her head. The autopsy showed the killer sexually assaulted her with an object before strangling her to death with the belt of her housecoat. The decoration found around Anna's neck would become the calling card of the Boston Strangler.
It was the first real signature to what was going to come, because the bathrobe belt was looped like a big bow up around her neck, and that was a kickoff to a series of crimes that I think to this day remains without equal.
At first, the Boston Homicide Squad wrote it off as just another freak murder. One detective summed it up as a routine break-in with complications. By the 4th of July, Boston police knew that something much more sinister might be going on. 2 more bodies had been found. Both women were in their 60s and were sexually assaulted and strangled with their own stockings. In each case, the naked corpse was posed for maximum shock value.
The way the bodies were left, the legs were spread, exposing her private parts. Even experienced police officers are shocked when they go in and see bodies spread like that. Not something you want to see every day, but we were seeing it every day.
In the press, the silk stocking murders were now front-page news, but the police were reluctant to say the stranglings were connected.
One or more killers is the quarry of a manhunt, which began in June and is continuing tonight.
In August, the bodies of 2 more elderly women, victims 4 and 5, were found. Then nothing for 3 months, as the city waited for the next strike.
The city of Boston had been reduced to a state of general hysteria. The pounds were cleaned out by women looking for dogs to protect them.
Women even resorted to carrying knives in case they were attacked. In December, the Strangler took 2 more victims. Sophie Clark, a 20-year-old student, and 23-year-old Patricia Bissett. The Strangler's taste in victims had changed dramatically.
Generally, serial killers run to a type in their victims. The strangling victims were all over the place. It was a group of elderly white women initially, then there was a gap, and the next victim was a beautiful young black woman.
In May of 1963, the killer crossed the river into Cambridge. Graduate student Beverly Sammons was found in her apartment near the Harvard campus. The autopsy concluded she died from multiple stab wounds to her chest. A violent new twist in the killer's MO.
Newspapers very early on were referring to the deaths of the elderly women as silk stocking murders, and in effect creating a template for murder for anyone who wanted to get rid of an inconvenient woman.
The last and youngest victim, Mary Sullivan, was killed just after New Year's Day, 1964. There were now 2,600 police in 3 counties working overtime to solve the murders, but not a single clue had panned out. They were getting desperate.
The police did some very bizarre things. One time they decided perhaps it was a lesbian. They sort of called into the police station all the known sort of lesbians in the South End.
The public's patience had run out. Edward Brooke, the Attorney General of Massachusetts, decided to take matters into his own hands.
Extraordinary methods of investigation are needed to deal with these highly abnormal and uncommon crimes.
He created the Boston Strangler Task Force to coordinate the investigation.
The Attorney General used his authority to take over the case. His detectives gave the orders as to what would be done.
Another year went by, and one of the biggest murder investigations in U.S. history had still failed to arrest a prime suspect. Enter F. Lee Bailey, the young, ambitious attorney who would make his name on the Strangler case. In March 1965, Bailey swooped in with the solution to all 11 murders. After a futile 3-year police manhunt, Bailey was offering to serve up the killer on a platter. His client, Henry DeSalvo, was already in jail awaiting trial for multiple sexual assaults. DeSalvo was ready to confess that he was the Boston Strangler. But there was one catch. His confession could never be used against him in a trial. According to Bailey and leading detectives on the Strangler task force, DeSalvo's confession was a slam dunk. When questioned, DeSalvo proved he knew things only the killer could know.
The answers came back just like that. There was never a hesitation. The Attorney General of Massachusetts said, let's close the case. This is the guy.
DeSalvo was assumed to be the killer, but the case was never tried in a court of law.
They had 11 unsolved murders. The city was in hysterics. This was the solution to it. They had one man who was willing to confess to these murders. Wrap it up, put it away, get it over with.
DeSalvo was presumed guilty on his confession alone. But on closer inspection, many experts think his words prove just the opposite. DeSalvo was a false confessor. They believe he had dealt the police a pack of lies. Albert DeSalvo's confession in 1965 to all 11 of the Boston Stranglings was taken to be the ultimate incrimination. DeSalvo's vivid reconstruction of each murder convinced the State Attorney General Edward Brooke to conclude that the Strangler was behind bars.
There were thousands of different details that were in play, and Albert was all too right about the vast majority of them.
He knew about the furnishings in the apartments, the layout, the clothing, all the way down to, carvings on the head of a bed.
But others argue it was the details of his confession that prove his innocence. They believe the 2,000 pages of confession transcripts reveal a trail of critical errors.
There were just enormous discrepancies between Albert's version of the murders and the crime scene reports, the autopsy reports, and the forensic reports. He allegedly had a photographic memory, but if he did, it failed him badly.
The jury is still out as to whether DeSalvo's story is authentic or a shameless grab for money and fame.
What did he get out of it? He got a book deal and he got a movie deal. It matters not that today we know he didn't profit one penny from that.
He was a tremendous braggart and a tremendous boaster, and he had an enormous desire to be famous.
The 50 hours of recorded interrogation have never been publicly released. Only a poor quality copy of part of DeSalvo's original confession is known to still exist. Besides the confession, the police had nothing on DeSalvo. There were no witnesses or forensic evidence linking him to any of the Stranglings.
DeSalvo was not a suspect because there was absolutely nothing to tie him to any of the crimes. He never appeared on anyone's radar screen.
DeSalvo's confession caught everybody by surprise. He was already locked up in Bridgewater State Hospital, awaiting trial for a series of sexual attacks known as the Green Man assaults. According to F. Lee Bailey, in early 1965, DeSalvo contacted him through his client George Nasser, also a Bridgewater inmate. DeSalvo had a story to tell, and he needed legal advice.
My initial impression of Albert would not cast him in the role of the Strangler at all. He was very polite, quite personable, had an easy smile to the point of guile, and he was shrewd. He knew he was never going to see the street again, and he was trying to make some provision for his family. He wanted to know if he could write a book about some things for which he had not been charged, without creating evidence that would enable the authorities to charge him.
To convince the Strangler Bureau that he had a viable suspect, Bailey asked the police to give him 5 questions that only the killer could answer. Armed with a dictaphone, Bailey drove to Bridgewater to see if DeSalvo was their man.
We called it the Big Five, and he hit 5 for 5. It was just boom, boom, boom.
2 of Bailey's Big Five questions are related to the murder of Sophie Clark. The 20-year-old medical student was the first of the Strangler's young victims. In DeSalvo's confession, he accurately described the woman who answered the door as tall, beautiful, and dressed in a half-slip and stockings. After talking his way in, DeSalvo said he grabbed Sophie from behind. He was surprised how quickly she passed out. DeSalvo described how, as Sophie was regaining consciousness, he strangled her. He tied the stockings so tightly, they disappeared into the folds of her neck.
Only the Strangler knew that the youngest and prettiest victim had under a stuffed chair a napkin she'd been using while menstruating. Only the person that removed it from her body and threw it there would know about it. And the other was a pack of cigarettes. Albert had knocked a pack of Marlboros, a box, off the bureau, had fallen down behind the bureau where you could not see it without moving the bureau. It was at that point that I became excited and I said to myself, bingo.
Confident his client was the Strangler, Bailey cut a shrewd deal with the Attorney General. The police could have DeSalvo's full confession, but they could never use it as evidence against him.
The police didn't find Albert, I did. And I had the reins, and I was dictating the rules. And I was doing that because I didn't want to put my own client in the electric chair.
Once word reached the top, Task Force Chief John Bottomley jumped on the chance to personally interrogate DeSalvo. Bottomley was a real estate lawyer with no criminal investigation experience. He was appointed to the job by his friend, the Attorney General.
The questioning was wrong to begin with. John Bottomley didn't do it right, and it should have been left to John Donovan or me, somebody with experience. And when he came out of the room after questioning Albert, he said to me, listen, it's no question, he's the guy. He was tickled pink.
Only a handful of lead investigators in the task force were privy to the details of DeSalvo's confession. It boiled down to the Attorney General Edward Brooke saying he's guilty. Take our word for it. At the time, Brooke was running for the U.S. Senate, and DeSalvo's confession conveniently wrapped up the case.
The type of individual he thought was guilty for the crimes.
The public and the press ran with the story. But privately, many police officers had their doubts.
There were many police who thought they had an eye on the case, thought they had a good suspect. I said to myself, this is going to really ruin dinner for an awful lot of police, because here goes their last hope for cracking the case.
It wasn't until 16 years later, when Susan Kelly was researching a book about serial killers, that the doubts surrounding DeSalvo's confession became public.
Every law enforcement person in the greater Boston area that I spoke to was telling me that Albert DeSalvo was not the Boston Strangler.
Kelly was one of the first journalists to obtain full transcripts of the confession. She was surprised to find that in many instances, DeSalvo's words were off the mark. The best example was in the case of Beverly Saymons. DeSalvo described how he had conned his way into her apartment. He jumped her with a switchblade. According to DeSalvo, he then tied her hands and repeatedly stabbed her in the breast and throat. DeSalvo claimed he took the murder weapon with him when he left and disposed of the knife in a swamp.
He got the murder weapon completely wrong. He insisted that it was a switchblade knife that he had stolen, when in fact the murder weapon was a kitchen knife that belonged to Beverly Sammons herself and that a Cambridge detective found in the drain board.
Detectives found traces of blood on the knife. They deduced that the killer had tried to wash away the incriminating evidence before leaving the murder weapon where he found it.
Albert did make some mistakes. On the other hand, I know very few people who could have remembered the very high percentage of correct details that he described.
Skeptics believe the fatal flaws in DeSalvo's story outweigh the details he got right. The question is, how did DeSalvo know so much?
He was fascinated by the crimes and that he had read the newspapers and actually even gone to the crime scenes after the murders to look at them.
Albert had a tremendous amount of information to the newspapers, thanks to the practice of the then medical examiner of handing out the autopsy reports like they were rewards or cookies to the press. In this day and age, the medical examiner wouldn't dream of handing out the autopsy report.
Many say that John Bottomley's line of questioning helped DeSalvo fill in the details.
The questions that DeSalvo was asked during his interrogation were very leading ones. He was sometimes given information to help him along when he was unsure of a detail. Albert's response is, "I'll tell you anything you want." DeSalvo was pretty much willing to say anything he was fed.
Some believe Bailey persuaded DeSalvo to confess to satisfy Bailey's own career ambitions. They suspect that DeSalvo was coached by his own defense attorney prior to DeSalvo's full confession to the police.
F. Lee Bailey asked him literally hundreds of leading questions, such as, was she wearing horn-rimmed glasses? So F. Lee Bailey trained Albert DeSalvo. He nurtured Albert DeSalvo to be the Boston Strangler.
I wanted to be very careful because I could see that it would come up. Not to be in a position where it were remotely possible I had fed Albert any information. And the only way to do that was to not be privy to what was going on. I did not go to a single interrogation session.
If DeSalvo had been tried as the Boston Strangler, most agree that the confession alone would not have been enough to convict him.
He was just presumed to be the Boston Strangler based upon some half-baked confessions that the government very willingly accepted under tremendous political pressure to solve the case. The proof just wasn't there that he committed these crimes.
It's not clear if the task force ever tried to confirm the confession by testing the forensic evidence against DeSalvo. There were fingerprints, human hairs, blood and semen found at the crime scenes. There were also eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen the killer. On closer examination, many now believe the hard evidence proves there was more than one Boston Strangler. The doubts about Albert DeSalvo's claim to being the Boston Strangler have sparked a crusade to reopen the case 40 years after the fact.
Today, the media and the public are much more aware of the phenomenon of false confessions. Juries want forensic proof to link a confession to a crime scene. And that forensic proof, I would put it to a jury, would not exist.
Many close to the case are convinced that when DeSalvo was declared the killer, other viable suspects were prematurely let off the hook.
Police had 6 active suspects in the homicides. The state attorney general's office left many of the real killers in this case on the streets.
I believe that the killings themselves were individual and they were done for purposes as diverse as the people who did them. There was one case, the murder of Patricia Bassett, in which someone was about to be indicted for her murder. And then DeSalvo began confessing. So the Attorney General's office discouraged the indictment.
The police also had a lead suspect in the murder of the last victim, Mary Sullivan. Casey Sherman, the nephew of the victim, believes that when DeSalvo confessed, the police may have let the real killer slip away. The suspect was seen hanging around the crime scene, acting suspicious.
They brought him in and gave him a formal interview. He went under a lie detector test, which he failed. They asked him, "Did you murder Mary Sullivan?" He said no. Mary had been propped up on the bed. She had been strangled by 2 scarves and a nylon stocking. And the killer had left an eerie calling card, which was a Happy New Year card placed between the toes on her foot. As you can imagine, it was horrifying.
There is a chance that a re-examination of the crime scene evidence, using modern forensic techniques, could end the argument over DeSalvo's guilt once and for all.
Physical evidence doesn't lie, whereas information from people is always subject to question. Information from physical evidence has no motive except the truth. Is there anything that specifically points to him? Not to my knowledge.
One of the key questions is if the physical evidence found at the scene of the crimes was ever used to confirm DeSalvo's story. Did any of the forensic evidence thought to have been the killers match DeSalvo? Remarkably, forensic investigators who collected and examined the evidence can't answer that question. They say they were kept out of the loop.
Fingerprints, hair, blood, samples were collected, and samples were tagged. Ultimately, those samples, many of them, were submitted to the FBI laboratory. I never got any report back from the FBI. When you send tests out and you don't get the results back, that can be discouraging sometimes.
Criminal defense attorney Elaine Sharp has taken up the fight to reopen the case on behalf of the DeSalvo family and the family of Mary Sullivan, the 11th and last victim. Sharp has filed a lawsuit against the state attorney general and the Boston police, demanding the release of evidence.
And at every single legal juncture, the government, the law enforcement authorities now in control of that evidence have stopped us and said, no, stop, you can't have that evidence. If it were tried today, I would bet my bottom dollar that the DNA testing would show that Albert DeSalvo would be excluded as the donor of all of the trace samples that were left at every single crime scene in which the Boston Strangler was implicated.
In the case of Mary Sullivan, her family took matters into their own hands. In 2000, they exhumed her body. Forensic scientists at George Washington University found traces of unidentified bodily fluids in her pubic hair that could have been left by her killer.
The evidence is very strong. When the pubic area was inspected, it showed that there was mitochondrial DNA there. That mitochondrial DNA did not match Albert DeSalvo's DNA.
The State Attorney General's office continues to refuse the Sullivan family's request to release the evidence for independent testing. As it stands now, the arguments for or against DeSalvo's guilt are deadlocked. As long as the physical evidence remains untested, the picture is incomplete. If the DNA results in the Mary Sullivan case suggest DeSalvo might not be her killer, it could raise even more doubt that he was telling the truth about all the stranglings. If further DNA testing of the evidence might be able to rule DeSalvo in or out, why not reinvestigate the entire case?
No one has given enough provocation to set that machinery in motion. 2 attorneys general gave their blessing because they thought the case was closed. Now, for the current attorney general to do further investigation, in his view, is to beat a dead horse.
Justice was not served by accepting these half-baked confessions. Justice was not served for any of the victims. What about the murderers of those women? They walked away scot-free. They may still be out there today. They may have killed other people.
Of all the murders in the Boston Strangler mystery, the most telling might be the prison killing of the self-proclaimed Boston Strangler himself. To this day, the death of DeSalvo is unsolved.
Somebody killed Albert to keep him quiet. He was silenced for a reason.
Who killed Albert DeSalvo and why? Six years after Albert DeSalvo confessed to being the Boston Strangler, he was stabbed to death inside Walpole Maximum Security Prison. Many believe DeSalvo's death wasn't just a random act of prison violence. According to DeSalvo's family and his psychiatrist, he was on the verge of recanting his confession. They believe he was killed to keep the truth buried. According to Dr. Ames Roby, DeSalvo's former psychiatrist, on November 25, 1973, DeSalvo called him from Walpole Prison. DeSalvo told him he needed to meet with him urgently.
He said, "I have something very important to tell you." And he indicated that he was going to retract his confession. Dr. Roby said, "Fine, I'll be down there." The next morning, a news report was that Albert DeSalvo had been found stabbed to death in his bed at Walpole Prison.
Just a week before his death, DeSalvo had requested to sleep in the prison infirmary because he feared for his life.
You have to get through 6 security checkpoints to get into the prison infirmary. His killer got in with a knife, stabbed him at close range, repeatedly in the heart, gets out covered in blood, goes past the checkpoints, nobody saw a thing. And Albert DeSalvo's killer was never found.
Prison officials stated Albert's death was related to his involvement in a prison drug operation.
He was assassinated not in connection with the stranglings, but because he was being too competitive in selling drugs inside the institution. His pricing was too low for those who were also in the business, and so they eliminated him.
But some don't buy the official story.
Albert tells Ames Roby he's going to spill the beans about how it came to be that he confessed to being the Boston Strangler. And then the very next morning, he was found stabbed to death in his cell. That's just too much of a coincidence not to be connected. I'm not that much of a believer in coincidence.
If there was a plot to kill Albert DeSalvo, the question is, who was behind it? There are several theories.
Those people who have an interest today in maintaining that Albert DeSalvo was the Strangler would be obvious suspects.
I've heard from many people, both inside and outside Walpole State Prison, that it was a contract hit from somebody who had a lot to lose on the outside.
One thing seems certain. If it was proven that DeSalvo wasn't the Strangler, many reputations would be at stake. F. Lee Bailey has his doubts about the account of DeSalvo's phone call to Dr. Roby, formerly the prison psychiatrist.
There was no proof that such a phone call ever took place. Ames Roby, in the view of many, had bungled the entire case. So I have some doubt that the phone call ever took place, but even if it did, Albert said he was recanting what? He had demonstrated a knowledge that couldn't have been fabricated. You can't unscramble those eggs.
Bailey believes that DeSalvo's real motivation for trying to back out of his confession was his ego.
I think Albert was probably once again trying to draw attention to the fact that he knew he was going to die in prison and nobody would care enough to try to find out what had made him tick.
What made DeSalvo tick is at the center of the argument over if he fit the profile of a serial killer. The opinions are split. Some of the psychiatrists who analyzed DeSalvo cited his disturbed childhood as the trigger for the stranglings.
He had been in training all his life to be the Boston Strangler. His father was a brutal and savage and cruel man who beat his wife, beat the children. He once broke the mother's fingers one by one in front of all the children.
But Dr. Roby, who knew DeSalvo prior to his confession, was never convinced he was the Strangler.
Dr. Roby didn't believe that Albert was a murderer. He did notice Albert's tendency to brag. He had to be bigger and better than somebody else. If you said to Albert, I committed 20 robberies, Albert would say, that's nothing, I've committed 200, when he had never done any such thing.
In 1965, there was no such thing as a serial killer expert. Today, some question if DeSalvo's background points to a pathological killer. DeSalvo's criminal history began as a petty thief.
All his life, he was what we call a B&E man, breaking and entering. He conned his way in most places, gift to gab.
DeSalvo's abnormal sex drive continually landed him in jail. In 1961, he was picked up for a bizarre string of sexual assaults called the measuring man crimes. DeSalvo bluffed his way into women's apartments, posing as a modeling agent.
He was talking to women and saying he would make them a model, pay them $40 an hour for modeling, and then he'd measure them, take the tape measure and see if they had the proper figure for it. And it was amazing. Some women would take off all their clothes and let him measure them.
In November 1964, DeSalvo was arrested for a series of sexual attacks known as the Green Man assaults. DeSalvo boasted to the police that he had molested over 300 women.
And one day, he had sex with 5 different women and was home by 5 o'clock. So he was an extraordinary person and probably had a disease akin to male nymphomania, which triggered the visits.
As the Green Man, DeSalvo threatened and molested his victims, but according to their testimony, he showed no desire to physically harm them. DeSalvo was obsessed with sex, but his track record gave no indication of the extreme violence of the stranglings. One could argue that DeSalvo became progressively more violent, from the Measuring Man to the Green Man to the Boston Strangler. But there's a catch. The Green Man assaults came after the stranglings.
To believe that Albert was the Measuring Man, the Strangler, and the Green Man necessitates that you believe he went from 1 to 10 to 3 on the scale of sex offenses, which just does not comport with what we know now about serial killers.
To say something doesn't make sense really is not a very meaningful statement. Nothing makes sense with serial killers.
The Boston Strangler case was the first of its kind in the United States. At the time, there were no serial killer experts who could testify to DeSalvo's personality, the patterns of the killings, or the possibility that DeSalvo falsely confessed. Would the testimony of today's experts point the finger at DeSalvo as the Boston Strangler? If the case were tried now, what would be the verdict? The Boston Strangler set the stage for a litany of sensational serial killer cases to come. The Zodiac Killer, Son of Sam, Ted Bundy. Understanding the psychological makeup of serial killers has become a police necessity. If we knew in 1965 what we know now, would the authorities have been as quick to accept the confession of Albert DeSalvo? Dr. Catherine Ramsland specializes in the psychology of serial killers. After scrutinizing the case, she questions if DeSalvo had the violent streak to motivate the stranglings.
Given what we do know about how DeSalvo treated women who were accosted by him in other ways, he was gentle, he was apologetic, somewhat remorseful. Someone like that then does not intermittently turn into a vicious slaughterer and violator of women and then go back and be nice to a few others.
Ramsland's hunch is that the Boston Strangler is a media invention.
The so-called Boston Strangler case does not strike me as the work of one killer. There are so many differences from the age of the victims to the way they were treated. This person would have had to completely change what triggers their sexual compulsion, and that isn't the nature of sexuality. You don't just change because you want to change or because you've had enough of killing elderly women. And now he could go target younger women who are more attractive. There's no psychology that makes sense of that.
Confession expert Dr. Saul Kasson examined some of the transcripts of DeSalvo's confession.
If you go back and look at some of the facts that he details in that confession, almost every one of them originates with the questioner. There's talk of a scarf, but the scarf comes from Bottomley. The scarf comes from his question. And then just moments later, again from Bottomley, he asks whether or not her legs were tied. When you run down the list about what happened, how it happened, whether she was naked, what she was wearing, whether she was tied, whether she was untied, Bottomley is leading and DeSalvo is following. That's the problem with this transcript. It's as if Bottomley is telling the story through DeSalvo.
Buried in the transcripts, Kasson finds clues to another potential information leak.
Sprinkled throughout the transcript are references that DeSalvo makes clearly to some object that seems present in the room. He would say something like, "This is the sweater right here," or "This is what I did here," as if they're looking at photographs. Anyone trained in law enforcement knows that you don't pre-expose the suspect to the crime scene. You have to remember that once a suspect admits to the crime, the post-admission confession is designed to prove it. Prove that you're the criminal. And when an interrogator walks into the room and provides all of that proof for the suspect, well, then the statement proves nothing. So I would then turn to the investigator and say, what else do you have? Because the confession is worthless.
As far as we know, the answer now is the same as in 1965. They have nothing else on DeSalvo. The only hope in salvaging the truth in the DeSalvo debate is DNA. On that score, almost everyone is now in agreement. The Attorney General's office has indicated that they are open to new testing under the right circumstances.
If there's a chance that the murders can be solved even 40 years later, I think the chance should be taken.
I support the notion 100%. I think all of those who really were involved in the case would.
I think re-examination by the appropriate authorities would be more than appropriate, and it's almost demanded.
The Boston Strangler case set many precedents. It was the first criminal investigation to be lionized in the press. The image of the Phantom Strangler evolved into a celebrity in its own right. Cash from the media rights to the story was on the table. Reputations were there to be won or lost. The head of the Strangler task force, John Bottomley, ended up with a Hollywood consulting job. In the blockbuster movie, The Boston Strangler, Bottomley was depicted as a heroic detective, played by Henry Fonda. The Attorney General, Edward Brooke, was elected to the United States Senate only a year after making the guilty call on DeSalvo. More recently, Brooke said he could not be certain that DeSalvo was guilty. F. Lee Bailey, who engineered the deal for DeSalvo's confession, got a cut out of the book rights to cover his fees. Bailey went on to become one of the century's biggest names in criminal defense.
There were people who made their careers on this case. The Boston Strangler was a creation of the mass media, and Albert DeSalvo filled the shoes of the Phantom Fiend.
Many people took a piece of the Boston Strangler, including DeSalvo himself. In prison, he capitalized on his fame by selling handmade choker necklaces. The story was buried with DeSalvo's murder in prison, but like a ghost, the saga of the Boston Strangler keeps coming back. When DeSalvo's body was exhumed by his family in 2001 to investigate his unsolved murder, they discovered that his vital organs were missing.
His lungs, his liver, his heart, his kidneys, and his brain were all missing. They'd all gone. Where are they? We believe that they were taken as part of the whole phenomenon of trophyism in this case. Everybody wanted a piece of Albert.
The underlying story of the Boston Strangler is about what happens when crime becomes a commodity. The final chapter of one of history's terror that followed. The bodies of 11 women are found strangled with their own nylons and lingerie.
We knew we had something because of the similarities in the way they were done. We knew we had a serial killer on our hands.
With each strike, the media's infatuation with the mystery killer ratchets up the climate of fear.
The city of Boston was in hysterics. The newspapers were announcing a phantom killer strikes again, scare headlines in 24-point type.
The pressure on the police to find the killer or killers is intense.
Boston has been portrayed by some as a city in the grip of terror.
We worked 24 hours a day and thought and lived the investigation of the stranglings.
Then, 3 years after the murders began, jailed sex offender Albert DeSalvo confesses to being the strangler.
No one else could possibly have known in exquisite detail what he knew about the crimes.
The investigation is shut down. All 11 murders are solved with the stroke of DeSalvo's pen. But not everyone working on the case is convinced.
Prosecutors, detectives were telling me that DeSalvo was not the strangler. It was common knowledge in the law enforcement community.
6 years later, DeSalvo is murdered in prison under suspicious circumstances.
But we were seeing it every day.
In the press, the silk stocking murders were now front-page news, but the police were reluctant to say the stranglings were connected.
One or more killers is the quarry of a manhunt, which began in June and is continuing tonight.
In August, the bodies of 2 more elderly women, victims 4 and 5, were found. Then nothing for 3 months, as the city waited for the next strike.
The city of Boston had been reduced to a state of general hysteria. The pounds were cleaned out by women looking for dogs to protect them.
Women even resorted to carrying knives in case they were attacked. In December, the Strangler took 2 more victims. Sophie Clark, a 20-year-old student, and 23-year-old Patricia Bissett. The Strangler's taste in victims had changed dramatically.
Generally, serial killers run to a type in their victims. The strangling victims were all over the place. It was a group of elderly white women initially, then there was a gap, and the next victim was a beautiful young black woman.
In May of 1963, the killer crossed the river into Cambridge. Graduate student Beverly Sammons was found in her apartment near the Harvard campus. The autopsy concluded she died from multiple stab wounds to her chest. A violent new twist in the killer's. Some think he was about to recant his confession.
Somebody killed Albert to keep him quiet.
If DeSalvo wasn't the Boston Strangler, who was?
Albert DeSalvo was never a suspect till he decided to identify himself as the Strangler. And there were a number of other much, much better suspects.
Many believe new forensic testing might solve the mystery.
DNA is the ultimate information of identification, and they're keeping that back from us. And the question is, are we entitled to that?
40 years after the fact, should the evidence be re-examined to try and prove DeSalvo's guilt or innocence once and for all? The first to die was Anna Slessers, a 55-year-old divorcee who lived alone in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood. From the crime scene, investigators deduced that Anna was listening to an opera on her record player and running a bath. She was murdered sometime during the day of June 14, 1962. No witnesses reported seeing anybody suspicious enter the building or walking up the stairwell to her third-floor apartment. As with all the stranglings, there was no sign of forced entry or screams heard by the neighbors. Anna must have willingly let her killer in the door. It was the first and most notorious serial murder case in American history. In 1965, Albert DeSalvo confessed to being the Boston Strangler, but he was never convicted of the 11 brutal, sexually deranged murders.
He knew things he could not have known from any source other than being on the scene of the crime.
But there is no physical evidence to link DeSalvo to the crimes.
There isn't proof that he was the strangler. In fact, the proof is that he wasn't the strangler.
People jump to conclusions. In murder, you can't afford to do that.
Was DeSalvo really the Boston Strangler, or a publicity-seeking false confessor?
Given the opportunity to confess to the worst serial killing since Jack the Ripper, he took it.
Did the real killer, or killers, get away with murder? Summer of 1962. The city of Boston is besieged by an unprecedented series of gruesome murders.
These were sensational crimes. Boston is a Puritan's town, and these were lurid, vicious, sexual crimes taking place.
During the 2-year reign of terror, the body was found naked on the floor. A pool of blood had drained out of a gaping laceration on the back of her head. The autopsy showed the killer sexually assaulted her with an object before strangling her to death with the belt of her housecoat. The decoration found around Anna's neck would become the calling card of the Boston Strangler.
It was the first real signature to what was going to come, because the bathrobe belt was looped like a big bow up around her neck, and that was a kickoff to a series of crimes that I think to this day remains without equal.
At first, the Boston Homicide Squad wrote it off as just another freak murder. One detective summed it up as a routine break-in with complications. By the 4th of July, Boston police knew that something much more sinister might be going on. 2 more bodies had been found. Both women were in their 60s and were sexually assaulted and strangled with their own stockings. In each case, the naked corpse was posed for maximum shock value.
The way the bodies were left, the legs were spread, exposing her private parts. Even experienced police officers are shocked when they go in and see bodies spread like that. Not something you want to see every day.